So, before this video, I had no idea that the words labor exploitation and AI would even go together. Because, when you think of AI, you're thinking neural networks, algorithms, very machine like, not human labor. However, there's so much deeper than I even realized that I learned from this video. So, that's why I talked to Dr. Hanna, who is a leading expert in this field, about how this applies to the AI industry as what are some solutions? How can we solve this issue? So let's talk about what I learned. It turns out there are multiple ways that labor exploitation exists in the AI industry.
The most glaring way that labor exploitation manifests in the AI sector is the way that AI data is produced. Any kind of content that comes out of ChatGPT, any type of filters, much of that manifests in how people are looking at the data, so-called cleaning the data. So that looks a lot like content moderation. Sometimes there's lots of gross and horrific stuff online. These workers are cleaning this stuff for 8 to 12-hour shifts, things like, making sure it's not describing incredibly violent behavior, using, violent slurs or violent language. When it comes to diffusion models, ensuring that that stuff isn't represented by gore or non-consensual pornography or child sexual abuse material. So just incredibly violent and disgusting stuff. Another kind of thing is that in some way we've all become laborers in a less violent and vicious way, but the way that our data is on the web, or we are tracked around whatever we do online, or we've got, our Apple Watches and our smartphones. Sometimes that, I mean, not sometimes, but all of the time, our data is being used to train these models in different ways. And that was much before ChatGPT or Midjourney or any of those tools. I mean, those kinds of things have been used for quite some time. I think are going to see more of that. I mean, the way that, data is scraped off the web, and things like our text, whether that's social media, whether it's on Twitter or Reddit or Instagram or whatever, that's being used to train different models. For some people, that's a bit more acute. So, for instance, for Amazon drivers, for instance, much of their data is likely being used to train models because Amazon would love to get away with having self-driving trucks or something like that. And so that's, used for that development, or like truck drivers here in California, where we both live. The Governor Newsom vetoed a bill that would have prohibited development of self-driving big rigs, 18-wheelers, that many unions like the Teamsters and the California Labor Federation was also very against. And I think lastly, when we talk about labor exploitation, we have to also think about the ways that AI tools are being used to kind of threaten workers. So even if it isn't labor exploitation outright, it's like the threat of having AI in the workplace can be used to really bring workers to heel, to basically say, you better do your job or take this crappy paying job, or else we're going to replace you with this tool that's going to write emails or schedule meetings. Even if they can't do it that well, it's still being used as a threat.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's really crucial to consider because a lot of what we see right now is that AI is kind of this trend that every company wants to follow. Every
Mm,
company wants to hop on the trend and have AI and have a tool that has AI. But
mhm,
people aren't really thinking about the negative consequences. Like you said, workers are sitting there for 8 to 12 hours, sitting and moderating to make sure that the content being outputted isn't violent, which
mhm,
I actually did not know that before. So that's actually
mhm,
really crazy to me right now. The labor laws right now, based on that, what are some of the gaps that kind of need to be fixed, I guess?
mhm. Yeah, so I mean, unfortunately, there's not a lot of protections for, workers in the US. Um, so the way that labor laws exist in the US, typically there's laws around how many hours you can work. There's laws around minimum wage. There's laws around, if you can organize a union. But just the baseline for all workers, there's not a lot of protections for that. Um, the laws are different in different countries. Like they're stronger in the UK, they're stronger in Germany, especially in places where there's what's called sectoral bargaining. That's basically like all the workers in a particular field maybe are covered under things that unions bargain for them. So it can be a little stronger there. Um, But in places like in the US, for instance, we basically don't have a lot of rights unless we are in a union. And unions can do things like protect against automation. They can protect against having to, sit through and look at all this content for 8 to 12 hours a day. But that's, most of the time the people in the US, I don't think anybody, not that I know of, there hasn't been any kind of union around content moderators or data laborers. In Kenya, there is, after a fight with Facebook, there's a few organizations that formed the African Content Moderators Union, and they have been trying to gain recognition and advocate for their rights as content moderators, primarily fighting companies that have contracts with Facebook, or rather Meta and Google and other companies like that. And so mostly that has taken the kind of turn of focusing on unionization. There are different mechanisms that can be used against, to address labor exploitation. Things like worker surveillance. The National Labor Relations Board in the US put out a memo that was kind of against labor worker surveillance through technology. Um, the things like the Amazon surveillance that happens to Amazon drivers, and the way that Amazon warehouse workers, oh, hello Kitty, and the way that Amazon warehouse workers are also subject to intense surveillance. They may have more grounds to file an unfair labor practice, what's called a ULP, but that's not really, if you file a ULP, it's a long process. It might take years. The makeup of the National Labor Relations Board really depends on who's president and who gets installed at the top. So there's not a lot of ways in which workers can really advocate through that body. The other kind of ways is that there are other organizations or other federal agencies and labor commissioners that can take more targeted enforcement actions. So, for instance, there's some ways in which the Federal Trade Commission has been very aggressive at targeting organizations like Amazon and Google, primarily for kind of usually on monopoly and their monopoly power, but there are often ways that they can address some of the worker issues. But those, it's not the main
Hmm.
reason they exist. So there's a lot of gaps, unfortunately. Um, local laws like in California, AB5 can help with some things like things that have to do with independent contractors. But AB5 has also been really weakened by Prop 22 that was passed in 2020, with huge spending from Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash. So it's a pretty patchy landscape.
I mean, so what I'm hearing is that because most of the solution is kind of forming unions and unionization, there's not a lot of power for the individual workers to
Hmm.
have. Generally, it's the higher up who have
Hmm.
that power to improve it. Are there any models of fair labor practices in AI or in AI maybe that you find maybe promising or could be kind of an example
Yeah.
for AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think there could be a few different things. I mean, sometimes if there are labor agreements that get agreed upon, they're often bilateral, like, so say like, the US imports something from, Bangladesh or something, and they then have to, sign kind of a trade agreement that maybe that gets produced more ethically or something of that nature. That's a possible model. I mean, I think that has become, I think, more on the radar, especially when it comes to clothing, because of kind of the worst excesses of sweatshops and sweatshop labor. And so there's potential intervention in AI supply chain from that perspective. So say if you use data or data workers in this country, you have to meet some kind of criteria. So that might be one model. There might also be something like local ordinances that effectively say, if you operate within this jurisdiction, you have to pay your workers so much. This applies for your contractors. AB 5 was an attempt at that. Basically, AB 5 said, you know, had a model kind of piece of model legislation. It was a model legislation insofar as it said, if you work primarily for this company, these people are your employees, and you have to give them all the rights that your employees have, and that includes things like a certain wage, a certain time off. They also are classified correctly, and worker misclassification is already a huge problem. But if they are your employees, employees that get a W-2 at the end of the year, then they get offered a bunch more rights. And so AB 5 is had some model is kind of one of the things that we saw was called the ABC test that offered that. And there's been a bill that's sat in the US Congress for several years called the PRO Act. Um, and and I think that is Protecting the Right to Organize Act. And what that would establish is it would establish basically a test for worker classification nationally. That bill has gotten 49 votes in the Senate, but basically has been, they have never brought it to the floor for risk of being filibustered. Um, Basically has all Democrats in favor of it. Um, and I think it depends a bit on what happens next month in November to see if it gets brought to the floor again. The PRO Act would be a huge deal. It's probably would it be it would be one of the biggest revisions to labor law probably since 1940s. Um, and it would be a huge step forward. I think it would really be a big boon for workers in the AI supply chain too.
I completely agree with that perspective. I do not know, to be honest, a lot about AI policy, AI law. Yeah, it's really interesting how a lot of these laws just honestly aren't there existent yet, which
Hmm.
is kind of surprising.
Hmm.
Do you have any kind of last thoughts that you want the audience to kind of keep with them, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you see anything, um, yeah, I mean, I think it's if there are workers who are saying, this kind of thing would hurt our job, and I think we see that in new ways, I think every day. I think it's important to lift up their voices. We see that all the time. We see that with artists, we see that with writers. We're seeing multiple cases work their way through the courts right now of creative people saying AI is really decimating our industry and is hurting our craft. There's been some huge wins, I will say, by, for instance, the Writers Guild of America. Last year, they won really great provisions in their contract that basically said, if you use it, you have to inform us if you use any AI material. You can't force us to use AI tools. And so, any kind of threat that's offered to their jobs or that's kind of been wielded over their jobs has been minimized by that. The actors, SAG-AFTRA, they got similar provisions, but they're a lot weaker. But we're seeing some wins happening all over, and I think unionization has been a big part of that. But we do need things that exist outside of unionization to protect all workers.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much for that. That was really good.